The 19th of June, 1944, aboard Taiho in the Philippine Sea, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on his flagship and drove the mobile fleet toward the carrier battle Japanese Doctrine had promised for years. Heat lay on the steel, sea glare flashed through the bridge windows, signal traffic moved under the throb of engines as the formation pushed west of the Marianas. His carriers were intact, his striking groups were going up, and Ozawa committed the fleet on the belief that long-range carrier aircraft, joined by land-based aircraft, could cripple the American force before it closed the distance. That faith was not private, it was operational. It was the method his command had carried into battle. So the launches went on. Deck crews worked, aircraft climbed, and the mobile fleet advanced, as if the old answer still held. On his side of the sea, nothing yet looked broken. The force still had carriers, still had aircraft, still had the will to strike first. Ozawa moved ahead certain that the decisive blow was still out there, waiting to be delivered. It was already too late for that confidence. By the 19th of June, 1944, the United States Navy had turned American carrier aviation into a system that could meet, blunt, recover, and strike again, and Ozawa was sending his air group straight into it in the Philippine Sea, west of the Marianas. Over 19 and the 20th of June, 1944, he would leave the battle with carriers still afloat but with his fleet air arm wrecked, and the Imperial Japanese Navy would come out unable to conduct another great carrier air offensive with its surviving fleet. The scale alone showed what was at stake. The battle involved 24 aircraft carriers and roughly one 350 carrier-based aircraft. That was the real weight behind the movement on Ozawa's bridge that morning. He was not handling a raiding force or a gesture. He commanded the Mobile fleet, the surviving carrier strength Japan was willing to stake on the fight for the Marianas after the American landings on Saipan on the 15th of June, 1944. If the plan worked, the approaching American fleet could still be cut before it completed the shield around the invasion. If it failed, the last serious offensive meaning of Japan's carrier arm would begin to drain away in a single battle. The ships themselves still gave the appearance of power, carriers in company, escorts around them, aircraft ranged, fueled, armed, and sent outward across open water. In institutional terms, this was exactly the kind of moment Japanese naval thought had prepared for. A decisive clash at range. A strike delivered before the enemy could close. A fleet commander betting that reach, timing, and concentration could still break the enemy first. Ozawa did not need to invent confidence on the 19th of June. The commitment of the fleet was confidence enough. He was pressing forward because Japan still believed its carrier arm could act as the decisive instrument of battle, even after earlier losses had narrowed what remained. The outward signs supported that belief. The carriers were present, the decks were working, the raids were leaving. To men watching from inside the formation, the weapon still existed because it was still in motion. That was why the stakes ran beyond a day's exchange of attacks. What Ozawa carried into the Philippine Sea was not only steel and fuel. It was the operational idea that surviving Japanese carriers could still shape the war at sea if they struck effectively at long range. If that idea held, the fleet remained a weapon. If it failed here, hulls alone would not save it. And this battle was large enough to test that belief without excuse. 24 carriers, roughly one 350 carrier-based aircraft. A commander whose task was to throw the remaining strength of Japan's carrier force into action at the very moment the United States was expanding its hold over the Marianas. There would be no smaller explanation afterward. Either the strike arm still had offensive value, or it did not. On the Japanese side, the movement of the day still looked disciplined, still looked purposeful, still looked like doctrine made real. The launches themselves were proof that the command had not abandoned the old answer. It was using it. That mattered. The coming result would not be the death of an idea left in storage. It would be the failure of an idea carried into battle at full operational scale. The staff could still tell itself the fleet had reached the proper moment. The force had sortied. The raids were in the air. The enemy had been found in the zone Japan had prepared to contest. But the numbers at the center of the battle were already larger than faith. 24 carriers and roughly one 350 carrier-based aircraft meant Ozawa had entered a contest where endurance inside the battle would matter as much as the first blow. From the Japanese side, the assumption still stood that striking first could decide the day. The sea ahead would show whether that assumption still belonged to reality. While that belief held on the bridge, the battle kept moving under it. Orders passed through the flagship. Aircraft departed in waves. The formation steamed on through heat and glare, every deck operation saying the same thing without words, that the mobile fleet was still an attacking force. That atmosphere mattered because it was not the atmosphere of a beaten command. Men around Ozawa were not standing beside a ruin. They were inside a machine still functioning by its own visible signs. Engines trembled through the ship. Communications continued. Carriers remained in formation. The operational day was active, not shattered. From within that world, the plan still had shape, and shape could be deceptive. A carrier force can look powerful long after the balance of a battle has turned against the aircraft that give it meaning. Ozawa's command still possessed the outward forms of offensive war on the 19th of June 1944. It could launch, it could maneuver, it could keep contact in mind and send strength outward over distance. All of that was real. None of it guaranteed result. The deeper pressure came from time. Every hour in the Philippine Sea forced the Japanese side to prove that launches were producing effect, not just activity. A strike that left the deck but failed to cripple the enemy did more than miss its target. It put the burden of the battle back on the force that had to prepare, dispatch, and rely on another one. On paper, that still looked possible. In practice, the day was beginning to ask whether repetition would favor Ozawa or the American carriers, waiting beyond his horizon. This was why the morning confidence carried a hidden danger, even before the losses were counted. The stronger the institutional faith in the long-range blow, the more likely the command was to answer disappointment by sending out more of the same. Not because the officers were irrational, because the entire purpose of the force rested on the belief that one more coordinated strike could still produce the decision earlier plans had promised. So the fleet continued, as fleets do when they still trust their instrument. It maintained formation, it worked its decks. It treated movement, launch, and commitment as signs of strength rather than signs of exposure. Nothing in the appearance of the ships announced what the battle was about to take from them. The danger lived above the waterline, in the aircraft already gone, and in the assumption that more could be sent after them without destroying the force's future inside the same engagement. For Ozawa, that made the Philippine Sea a harsher kind of test than a simple exchange of gunfire. A ship can survive damage and remain visibly present. A carrier can survive with its deck under it and still lose the very thing that made the deck matter. That difference had not yet become undeniable on the morning of the 19th of June. It was only beginning to press inward through reports, delays, and the widening distance between launch and result. On the Japanese side, the answer could still be spoken with confidence. The fleet was attacking. The ships were still there. But the battle would measure something harsher than presence. It would measure whether the force Ozawa commanded still possessed the offensive air strength to make those holes instruments of decision. The command could still act as if the next strike would restore the pattern. 24 carriers and roughly 350 carrier-based aircraft had gone into the battle. The weight was immense. The margin for illusion was not. Behind that morning on Taiho stood the older faith that had taught the Japanese Navy what a carrier battle was supposed to look like. The 7th of April, 1941, the South China Sea. Jisaburo Ozawa was then a vice admiral commanding the Southern Expeditionary Fleet, not yet the commander of the mobile fleet, but already a naval officer, marked inside the Imperial Japanese Navy as a serious thinker about how aircraft, surface forces, and distance could be used together. In the opening months of the Pacific War, Japanese naval prestige rested on the belief that an enemy fleet could be found, struck first, and weakened before a gun line ever came into range. That belief did not begin with him. By June 1944, he inherited what was left of it. The method had given Japan real authority. In 1941 and 1942, the carrier arm had shown that coordinated aircraft could hit far beyond the horizon and hit in concentration. The lesson the institution carried forward was simple and dangerous. Reach meant initiative. A force that could launch first could shape the battle before the enemy answered. Ozawa became important because he belonged to the school that still treated naval aviation not as support for the fleet, but as the fleet's cutting edge. The 14th of July, 1942, the combined fleet created the Third Fleet as a carrier command. The Japanese Navy had already learned that dispersal wasted striking power, so it concentrated carriers and air groups for decisive use. Ozawa's reputation grew inside that world. He was identified with mobile carrier employment, with long-range offensive action, and with the idea that coordination across several decks could still produce a battle-winning blow. He was not a dreamer standing outside Doctrine. He was one of the officers trusted to carry it. By 1943, after earlier carrier losses had narrowed Japan's options, that trust mattered more. Ozawa took command of the mobile fleet on the 29th of August, 1943. He was receiving a force diminished by attrition, but still presented as an offensive instrument. The carriers remained. So did the Doctrine. What had changed was the margin for error. The fleet no longer possessed the abundance it had once enjoyed, which made every future battle depend even more heavily on getting the first strike right. June 1944 gave him the exact kind of battle Japanese Doctrine had imagined for years. Operation A-Go was the response to the American move into the Marianas. The plan called for the fleet to engage near the decisive area and for carrier aircraft to work in concert with land-based aircraft. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would become the last of the 5 major carrier versus carrier battles in the Pacific. For Ozawa, that did not look like an ending. It looked like the proper test of the surviving carrier force. What his side saw in him was not romantic legend. It was professional credibility. He commanded the fleet that still carried Japan's offensive hope at sea. He had senior backing. He had the surviving flight decks. He had aviators, deck crews, and escorts organized around one inherited assumption that a concentrated strike delivered at range could still crack an approaching American fleet. That was why the force retained meaning even after earlier disasters. It was built to attack before it was attacked. And the machine still appeared able to do it. Carriers could range aircraft, arm them, launch them, and send them outward across distances that had once favored Japan. A commander looking at that capability in June 1944 could still believe the old method remained intact because its visible parts were intact. Deck operations continued. Signals moved. Escorts screened. The force still looked like a weapon because it could still perform the motions of one. Inside that confidence, Ozawa did what his institution had trained itself to do. He accepted battle on the premise that offense at range could restore the initiative. That was the center of his authority and the center of his danger. The Japanese Navy had built prestige on first blows. Ozawa was now the officer entrusted to prove, under Operation A-Go, that the first blow was still enough. He did not need a speech to explain it. The fleet around him explained it. "We can still fight this battle our way," his command could say. He had been given the mobile fleet on the 29th of August, 1943, and by June 1944, he had carried that inheritance into the last great carrier trial of the Pacific, the 15th of June 1944, the waters around the Marianas. The American landings on Saipan triggered the Japanese response exactly as the operational scheme required. Operation A-Go was not improvised under panic. It was the planned answer. Ozawa's force sortied because the Japanese command still believed a fleet action fought in that zone could produce the old result. The presence of the American move did not shake the Doctrine. It summoned it. That mattered, because a Doctrine only keeps authority if it can still generate action. In June 1944, the Japanese carrier force did generate action. It moved into position. It prepared strikes. It relied on the long reach of naval aircraft, and on the assumption that coordination with land-based aircraft would thicken the blow. Nothing in that preparation forced Ozawa to think the instrument had gone empty. The fleet still possessed the means to launch large attacks over open sea. On his side, that still counted as proof. The 19th of June, 1944, west of the Marianas, Ozawa sent out large strike waves. That fact alone told his staff that the carrier arm had not ceased to function. Carriers that cannot launch are broken in plain sight. His were launching. Aircraft left the decks in strength. Orders were being acted on. A commander committed to decisive carrier doctrine could read that as confirmation that the battle was unfolding on terms Japan had prepared for. There was early reason to keep believing it. Japanese aircraft still reached the battle space. American carriers still had to defend themselves. The sea had not become closed to attack simply because the balance had shifted. For Ozawa, that distinction was vital. If raids were getting out and finding opposition, then the offensive instrument still existed in fact, not in memory. The failure of one attack would argue for another attack, not against the method itself, so he continued to commit force on the 19th of June. That decision did not come from blindness. It came from the logic of the command he held. A fleet built around a long-range strike cannot preserve its purpose by refusing to strike. Every launch that day answered the same institutional demand that had shaped Japanese naval thought before the war. Deliver concentration at distance. Reach the enemy first. Force the result in the air before the surface fleet settled the issue. The Americans were already present in a way the Japanese side could feel without fully naming. Raids encountered defenders far from the carriers. Returns thinned. The space between dispatch and effect widened. Yet none of that amounted, in Ozawa's view on the 19th of June, to a final verdict. A battle this large could still appear recoverable if one more wave got through, one more concentration landed, one more opening appeared in the enemy's screen. The old method had worked often enough to demand one more proof. That is why the first half of the battle looked, from his bridge, less like collapse than persistence. The ships still maneuvered. The force still attacked. Offensive reach had not vanished. Even disappointment could be read as delay rather than failure, because the fleet remained in action, and the command still retained the ability to send aircraft outward. To an enemy commander shaped by carrier doctrine, capability in motion could still look like capability preserved. He kept faith with the instrument because abandoning it would have meant admitting the fleet had reached battle with nothing else to decide it. Send them again, his side could say, because the carriers were still operating and the battle had not yet denied them that right. On the 19th of June 1944, Ozawa was still committing additional strikes. The 19th of June 1944, west of the Marianas. The arithmetic stopped closing before the battle had finished speaking. Large strike waves went out from Ozawa's carriers, and American defenders met them well short of decisive effect. The Japanese side could still count launches. It could not count matching results. Aircraft had been dispatched in strength, yet the American fleet remained in fighting order, and the carriers that had sent those raids were already thinner in effective air strength than when the morning began. That was the first break in the old pattern. Under Japanese doctrine, a long-range carrier strike was supposed to reduce the enemy before the next move. Here the launches were consuming the very arm that made launching possible. The carriers were still present. The offensive return was not arriving in equal measure. For a fleet built around naval aviation, that mismatch was more dangerous than visible damage to steel. The 19th of June, 1944, aboard his flagship in the Philippine Sea, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa answered the failed weight of the first attacks by continuing to commit additional strikes. The consequence was countable. It was not one raid, but more than one wave sent out on the same day in pursuit of the same decisive effect. A commander still convinced the instrument worked, did the only thing that doctrine allowed. He spent more of it. The 20th of June, 1944, the Philippine Sea. Ozawa was now maneuvering a force already reduced in effective air strength, while still trying to preserve contact and offensive reach. The reaction changed with the day. This was no longer only a matter of sending more aircraft. It was the handling of a carrier force, whose decks remained but whose striking arm had been cut down in action. The consequence was also countable. The battle had entered its second day, and the force making that turn was weaker in aircraft than the one that had opened it. Neither reaction was surrender. Both were adjustment inside doctrine. On the 19th of June, he committed more attacks because the fleet still looked operational. On the 20th of June, he maneuvered to keep the battle alive because the carriers still floated and the command still sought contact. The danger was that each of those choices accepted the same hidden fact. Presence was no longer the same thing as power. His side could still put the thought into disciplined words. We still have the decks, and we still have the fleet. The harder number was the one that followed. By the 20th of June, 1944, it was already a two-day battle, and every launch was asking the same force to fight with less than it had carried in on the first day. The carriers had not disappeared, but the count that mattered was beginning to move somewhere else. That count moved first in the air, and by midday on the 19th of June, it was already changing the way Ozawa could use his fleet. From the Japanese side, the first loss was freedom. Raids that were supposed to range outward and converge on the American carriers were being intercepted deep in the approach. Aircraft were not merely failing to land a decisive blow. They were being cut down before they could choose where to spend themselves. Ozawa had launched 4 major attack waves that day, about 373 carrier aircraft in all. A striking force that large should have widened his options. Instead, it narrowed them. Each wave left him with fewer trained crews to shape the next one. The second loss was coherence. The battle did not punish one mistake and then stop. It kept charging interest. Some aircraft never found the target area. Some broke formation. Some reached the American screen and were destroyed there. Others came back to the wrong ships or had to ditch when fuel ran out. By evening, Japanese carrier aviation had paid for every outbound mission twice, once on the way in and again on the way home. Of the roughly 373 carrier aircraft sent out on the 19th of June, about 243 were lost. The carriers remained in formation. Their air groups did not. That afternoon, the subtraction reached beyond the decks and into the command network itself. American submarines struck the carrier force while the air battle was still unfolding. Albacore hit Taiho. Kavala hit Shokaku. One was Ozawa's flagship. The other was one of the fleet carriers his force could least afford to lose. A carrier commander can shift his flag. He cannot shift the air crews that go down with a ship, or the maintenance spaces, fuel systems, and deck routines that vanish with it. By nightfall, Taiho and Shokaku were gone. Ozawa had lost not only aircraft, but working flight decks and the internal capacity that made deck operations possible at all. The fourth loss was reach. Ozawa transferred his flag to Zuikaku, but a transfer under battle conditions is not restoration. It is interruption. Orders still moved, but through a fleet now carrying fewer intact command spaces and fewer air groups able to execute them. On paper, surviving carriers still gave him a striking force. In practice, every new order had to travel through a fleet that had already watched two major decks disappear, and had already burned through a large share of the men who knew how to make coordinated attacks work. The shape of command survived. Its effective radius shrank. Through the night and into the 20th of June, the arithmetic forced a quieter kind of fear. The Japanese force turned away, trying to preserve contact while also preserving fuel and aircraft. That is not the movement of a fleet choosing among good options. It is the movement of a fleet doing staff work inside a deficit. He still had carriers. He still had aircraft. He no longer had enough of either in the right combination to risk them freely. The offensive problem had become procedural. What could be launched? What could be recovered? What could be found? What could still be coordinated after a day like the one just passed? Late on the 20th of June, when American carriers finally sent their long-range strike, the ring closed on what remained. The Japanese force could still put fighters into the air and still fire back from the screen, but the shrinking margin showed everywhere. Hio was sunk. Other carriers were damaged, tankers were hit, aircraft that rose to defend the fleet were lost, and aircraft that survived the combat still had to find their way back after dark to decks already crowded by confusion in short, unexperienced hands. The battle no longer asked whether Ozawa could launch. It asked what launching had left him with by the end of the second day. What it left him with was a fleet still visible on the horizon and an offensive arm no longer equal to its own hulls. The losses were not abstract. 2 carriers sunk by submarines in one day. Another carrier sunk on the next. Hundreds of carrier aircraft expended across repeated missions that had not secured command of the air over the fleet. The men who remained had to do more with less training depth, less deck space, less fuel margin, and less time. The mobile fleet could still speak in the language of order and endurance. We have suffered heavy damage to our air strength, and the battle has become difficult. The harder figure sat behind that sentence. About 243 carrier aircraft were gone on the 19th of June alone, and the fleet that remained had to face one more strike with the machine behind the American cycle still intact. On the morning after that first day, the answer to the anomaly was no longer hidden in the distance between fleets. It was in the American battle cycle itself. Ozawa's raids had not failed because one interception happened to be timely. They failed because the same carrier force that put up the first interception could do the whole sequence again and again. Detection by radar, direction by fighter control, interception far from the carriers, recovery, rearming, refueling, relaunch. The Americans did not need a single perfect moment. They needed a system that made each Japanese approach run into a fresh defense. That was why the count never closed for Ozawa. A launch from his side consumed a scarce pilot, a scarce aircraft, and scarce deck time. A launch from the American side entered a larger cycle spread across more decks and supported by fighter direction that kept pushing the meeting point outward. He could still put aircraft into the air. He could not make the act of launching regenerate what launching cost him. The battle punished him not only when his raids were broken up, but every time he had to prepare another one under the same conditions. He reacted the way a serious carrier commander would. He did not freeze inside the first bad returns. He kept trying to recover the old advantage through adjustment. He continued to commit waves on the 19th of June because concentration still offered the only path to decisive effect. On the 20th of June, he turned to preserve contact and keep a wounded striking force in being. Those were not random gestures. They were rational changes inside a doctrine that had run out of favorable arithmetic. The same arithmetic ruined every countermeasure. Dispersion could protect what remained of his carriers, but it weakened concentration. Concentration could thicken a strike, but it exposed more aircraft to the same outer screen. Pulling back preserved fuel, yet it lengthened range and complicated recovery. Pushing forward increased the chance of contact, yet it brought a reduced air arm closer to a fleet that could still cycle fighters and strike aircraft across multiple decks. Every adjustment exchanged one deficit for another, none restored control. That is why the battle's second day matters as much as the first. Ozawa still had enough force to think in offensive terms, but not enough margin to absorb another full cycle against him. The American late-day strike on the 20th of June was not simply a blow at ships. It was proof that the system remained productive after a full day of combat. He had spent aircraft trying to force a result on the 19th of June. The Americans still had the deck rhythm, the command handling, and the pilot depth to reach out late on the 20th of June and impose one more expensive problem on a retreating fleet. From the Japanese side, the result was institutional before it was final. Carrier doctrine had promised that trained air groups, properly launched at range, could decide the battle before the enemy imposed his own sequence. In the Philippine Sea, Ozawa discovered that the enemy sequence was the battle. Once American fighter direction repeatedly broke the approach and American carriers kept cycling aircraft through the day, Japanese doctrine no longer failed at the end. It failed every time it tried to begin again. That drove the command toward a gamble with no reserve behind it. He had to keep the fleet in contact because disengagement conceded the Marianas and the battle. He had to preserve what remained because another day like the first would leave him with decks and almost nothing to fly from them. He had to think offensively with a force increasingly shaped by defensive needs. That is what desperation looks like in a carrier staff. Not shouting. Choice under subtraction. The conclusion forming inside the fleet was colder than panic. The problem was not that one attack had been repulsed. The problem was that each attempt to recover the initiative fed the same American cycle and reduced the Japanese answer to it. The first mobile fleet could still move. It could still signal, it could still put carriers on the map. It could not restore the trained striking groups already spent. A staff officer in that position could say the enemy's fighter defense and repeated carrier operations had made effective attack extremely difficult. The number that followed was simpler. By the end of the battle, Japan had lost around 300 carrier aircraft, and the surviving decks were moving into the next phase without the air groups that had justified the operation. Through the afternoon of the 20th of June, the approach to the break still looked procedural. Ozawa had shifted to Zuikaku after losing Taiho, and the surviving carriers were still turning, signaling, and trying to preserve order inside retreat. Nothing in a fleet's silhouette tells you whether its doctrine is already dying. Masts still stood. Screens still maneuvered. Aircraft still had to be counted, armed, spotted, or searched for. The crisis remained inside the paperwork of combat. How many machines were left? Which decks could still handle them? Which groups still had enough trained men to fly another coordinated mission? Then the American strike reached him late in the day, after a search and launch sequence his side could no longer match. It came at long range, and at the end of a battle cycle the Japanese had been trying to survive since the previous morning. Ozawa's ships still had anti-aircraft guns. They still had fighters. They did not have a restored air arm. The defense could disrupt. It could not reverse. Bombs and torpedoes found carriers and oilers in a fleet already carrying the losses of the first day. Hio took the fatal hit and was lost. Zuikaku survived. Junyo survived. Chiyoda survived. So did Ozawa. That distinction mattered because survival of hulls now hid the real collapse. A carrier afloat without a trained air group is not the same weapon it had been at sunrise on the 19th of June. The Japanese formation that rode into the battle as a striking fleet was leaving it as a collection of decks with too little offensive air power to use them in the old way. The break was not only at sea, it was inside the institution that had sent him there. Carrier doctrine had always demanded confidence from subordinates, because the whole method depended on committing aircraft before the enemy's result was known. In the Philippine Sea, that confidence meant the one thing it could not out-argue: return counts, missing crews, damaged decks.